Okay. Yeah, here at FAO, we kind of try to maintain the big picture of what's happening with genetic improvement globally. And whilst selective breeding is becoming more important and is definitely happening for many of our high value species, we also see that for many of our particularly lower value species in developing countries, that selective breeding and adoption of selective breeding is very slow. And one of the things that we're trying to stress through our global plan of action is to find ways to accelerate that. So my question, which was stimulated by Diego's presentation, is I think it's very important, the stress that has been put by a couple of speakers on the fact that these two approaches, gene editing and selective breeding, are complementary. But in cases where we don't have selective breeding going on, I guess I was being a little bit provocative in asking if there's a role for gene editing work in species where we don't have selective breeding. And I think Diego already responded that sometimes it's just really difficult to find investors or people that are willing to invest in the logistics and maintaining families, etc., for a selective breeding program. But and in those circumstances, there can still be a role for gene editing. And I think that's probably true, but I don't think that should happen in isolation of consideration for managing variation across the whole genome, because that's an important role for selective breeding programs as well as selecting for better genes. They are also maintaining genetic diversity, and that's something that's important across the entire aquaculture sector. So I guess that's the point. It's not really a question, or Diego's already answered the question, I think, but just a point that that we see is quite important from a global perspective. Thanks.
Thank you, Graham. It's also good to have it on video because this is recorded and it will be published in YouTube. So, Diego, Antti, would you like to comment?
I just want to say I fully agree with Graham. Definitely, I mean, we should push to get selective breeding incorporated worldwide in as many species as possible. It's a logistical problem, as you said, more than being able to do it, right? And I think in some cases, when there's a big problem, like a disease is really, destroying production for one particular species, in that case, there might be a point in, going with genome editing, even if there is no breeding program. But I fully agree that we should aim to first put our effort into getting the breeding programs up and running. Yeah.
Antti?
If I can reflect also, for major species like what I presented, of course, there are large resources to do very advanced breeding programs and with genomic selection. For much smaller species in terms of commercial operations in aquaculture, it's easy to make, or it's possible to make these low-cost breeding programs, and they are very efficient and they work. They require much less resources, money, and skills. And what is there important is that if that sort of thing is planned, there needs to be some sort of stakeholder or owner of the breeding program who will make sure that it's a long-term operation, that they will run it for tens of years, and it may be like a combination of farmers, a combination of companies, or I don't know, governmental institute, or there's the World Fish Center in Philippines is an example. Somebody who will take responsibility that it's a long-term thing, because otherwise it will not be so useful. There are examples, good examples how this can be made.
Thank you, Antti. Alan, is there anything else you would like to add?
No, I think I agree with that. I think the point I made about the discipline and organization that you need to run a breeding program is very similar to the discipline that you need to run a genome editing program. So the benefits of having a breeding program in place first, to me, are obvious. And we could have breeding programs organized for species, and we have the tools that are available to people to use to help them develop their breeding programs, and then add in genome editing at that stage.
Thank you. Thank you. Any other comments, Graham, after the responses? Well, very much aligned with your comment anyways.
Yeah, I mean, I think the point Antti raises is a very important one. Any investment in selective breeding must be long term. We see that in some countries, it's the state sector that seems to consider that they have responsibility for genetic improvement. But I think my experience of seeing the long-lasting, impactful breeding programs, either they transition into a private sector, such as what's happened with the Norwegian salmon breeding program. But I think if the private sector is involved from the beginning, I think it gives these programs a better chance of long-term success. And we should, the long-term planning should be considered at the very beginning of these operations, which is the point Antti made.
Thank you. Very nice to have your opinions. So maybe I can ask a question, because we also mentioned that there are some possibilities for future advances, and in some cases, as you have mentioned, we are still at the beginning of the breeding practices in aquaculture, while in others we are so much advanced. Well, we already answered the question about how we can link it, but what kind of other collaborations or partnerships could be necessary or could be established in order to really to involve all the breeding companies or all the sectoral actors into this future developments in precision aquaculture breeding? Or are there any research ideas which we should integrate also, like the commercial partners together, to help them build their capacities? Anyone can respond, or is it maybe a too long question?
No, I can comment. I'm sure everyone, all of us, will have similar views. To me, it's fundamental to be a partnership with breeding companies that are going to implement the technologies. And actually, they are driving a lot of the technological innovation in terms of implementation. But in terms of what, for example, genomating, when it comes to discovery of genes and research, that's where the academics play a bigger role. But yeah, fundamental that it's a partnership, in my opinion.
I can also make a comment. I think many of the benefits that we will see from genome editing and the benefits that we see from conventional genetics as well, they deliver in the performance of our animals in production and processing plants. And when we're talking about sustainability traits and biodiversity, they deliver at a society level. So it's important that we have recognition further down the production chain of the value of these benefits, that the breeding companies are investing in technology to improve performance, but the breeding companies themselves don't see that value. The value is seen by people further down the production chain, and we need to have stronger links right through the production chain, right through the value chain, that allows us to release some of that value back into investment in breeding programs and investment in technology.
Yeah, I think it's also a very important comment. It's not just the breeding companies, because we also, I think, have to convince or include all the chain actors in this improvement progress. Antti, do you have any comments?
Well, I could comment this from the perspective of the current project. So I think the direction what we have in European Union is very good. And if you think about AQUAIMPACT, which is very applied, we really apply things in the breeding programs. That's our core action. And then in AQUA-FAANG, it is focused on this longer term view, that we understand the genome better, we can understand the structural variants, we can annotate the genome, so understand where the different genes are. That is like the, let's say, the combination of these two is the way to go forward. It's a long way, so but it is the direction that needs to be taken. There will be no like quick magical solutions. Is step by step, but the direction is exactly the correct things. We just go forward and generate new tools step by step. I have been very happy with this webinar where we have combined the two projects.
Yes, yes, I think it was very fruitful. But I have one more question. Since now the Green Deal has objectives of increasing organic production, this goes along also for the aquaculture sector, and new calls are on organic aquaculture. How do you think gene editing or new genomic techniques could add into that, into increasing the organic production in aquaculture? Or does it fit there in the organic regulations?
I'll be controversial and say I don't see any difficulty with applying genome editing in an organic situation. I see the technology as delivering mutations, targeted mutations that could occur naturally that are no different from mutations that would occur anyway. All we're doing is accelerating that process, and I don't see why we couldn't be using genome editing in an organic production system.
But what kind of like other opportunities it could bring? Yes, Antti?
Yes, the benefit of the current development in the genomic research is that the information what is gathered, it helps the gene editing technology, but it also helps the genomic selection, so the traditional breeding. It's a win-win thing. And then if we think about the organic farming, then the traditional selective breeding is okay for organic farming. So all the new information what we get, if we are able to apply them in traditional breeding programs, then that will help the organic farming side. And I want to stress that the information what we are getting, it helps both the gene editing part and the selective breeding programs simultaneously, which is good.
Okay. Diego, would you like to comment further?
I agree with Alan that this shouldn't be a problem to apply genome editing into organic aquaculture, but I think that currently it is probably not allowed. So basically, if you have genome editing, it will not be considered organic. It's a legislation problem. In practice, it shouldn't be a problem. I agree. No.
Yes, but I think it's the biggest barrier.
Yes.
So, okay. Yes, Antti, please go on.
If I can a little bit change the topic, this consumer perception is extremely important here. And let's say my experience and what I have got from the reports, even the ones that were reported here, is that gene editing is much more easily accepted by people compared to the GMO transgenesis. And in AQUAIMPACT, we were even thinking that, I mean, when we communicate what we do in breeding programs, we typically communicate with farmers who understand already, they have a high level of understanding what we do. And the consumers are one step further from us. So we were discussing in AQUAIMPACT, like, how do we communicate about genomic selection? Because we want to talk about DNA and genomics. And we were like thinking that, are these words something to which the consumers react, perhaps in a negative way? And then we actually tested this. So we had a consumer study in Finland, France, and Spain, 500 people in each. And one question was that about the acceptance of genetics in food production. And the first question was that if we have brood stocks and we want to improve traits and we use pedigree and family information, then what is the acceptance? Then the second question is that if we use DNA information and genomic information, then what is the acceptance? And then the third question was that if it's transgenesis, so GMO, we didn't split it into gene editing and the GMO, but it was really about the, let's say, the old-fashioned GMO. And then the result was that if it's pedigree, it's the highest acceptance level. If we say genomics and DNA, its acceptance is reduced only very little. And when it's a GMO, then it crashes the acceptance. So we were kind of happy that DNA and genomics as words, they don't have this sort of negative perception in the consumers, because that could have been also the case.
Yes, but I think this totally goes in parallel with what Sigrid said, that I think it's mostly about people are hesitant about what they don't know.
Yes.
It is very difficult for the society to understand actually what is gene editing, especially in animals, because we have been facing this GMO perception for years. It is very easy for them to mix it now, especially gene editing is also under GMO regulation in Europe. So I think maybe the next steps for researchers and also the breeding companies and the sector actors, first try to inform the stakeholders next to them, like if it's a breeding company, to their producers and the producers to maybe the chain and the consumers. So it goes a little bit like that. We must increase the awareness and increase the knowledge about the new technologies, because it is totally understandable that when people don't understand what is going on behind, they're afraid of it or they don't want to accept it. Okay, well, I think we are already over our time. If there are no final comments, are there? Do you have any final comments to make before closing? We have, okay.
Thank you very much for organizing this, Carol.
Yeah, thank you for joining, for all of you. I know that Ellen had to leave as well, and Ellen to Sigrid as well, and Antti. And this was the final of our webinar series, at least for now, let's say. Thank you everybody for your participation. You can always email the speakers if you have further questions. And yes, have a nice day, and see you hopefully in our next webinar series.
Yes. And thank you for organizing.